Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my YouTube live stream event this evening. I appreciate everyone who's going to be stopping in to say hello, to be a part of the Q&A portion and more. It's good to be back here with all of you in the community. And I'm very pleased tonight to be joined by Scott Ellsworth. Scott Ellsworth is the New York Times best-selling author of The Secret Game, winner of the 2016 Penn ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. He's written about American history for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Formerly a historian at the Smithsonian Institution, he's also the author of The World Beneath Their Feet and Death in a Promised Land, his groundbreaking account of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Scott teaches in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
I'm delighted to have you, and I very much appreciated your book. I still have my copy here with all of my pencil marks in it because I'm one of those active readers who loves to make pencil marks in this. And again, everyone who is joining us, you can find a link to the book above in the chat. Scott, I want to ask first and foremost, what inspired you to write this book?
All right, so I will try to keep this not too long because I could talk for a long time. There's sort of three streams that kind of play into this. One was the fact that I've been interested in the Civil War since I was a little kid. So I'm 71 now. So during the centennial of the Civil War in the early 60s, I'm already collecting stamps. I'm watching programs. I'm listening to, records about the Civil War and all that. So that was an early introduction. And then when I was 10 years old, we took a family vacation from our home in Oklahoma to the East Coast. I convinced my parents to go to Gettysburg and Antietam. And so over the years, I've just kept up with things. I worked as a historian at the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian, would walk by Civil War artifacts all the time. 15 years in DC, the Civil War is a big presence, would lead bike tours at Gettysburg and all that. So I had some long familiarity with it. But I was also, when I finished my last book, The Groundbreaking, it came out in 2021, I was looking for a new subject. And one thing that was in the back of my mind is that here in the United States, we have never, not in my lifetime, have we been so bitterly divided politically. And even, my memories of as a teenager of the late 60s and early 70s, it's much worse now. And I was thinking about really the period that closest mirrors that would have been in the 1850s and 1860s. So that was somewhat in my mind. But it also came through a kind of a weird door, which was my agent said, well, have you thought about writing a true crime book? And I knew In Cold Blood by Capote backward and forward. I knew The Executioner Song by Norman Mailer and some of the great ones. I thought, well, that's interesting. Incidentally, true crime books sell through the roof. The readership is almost entirely women, interesting for the 20s to their 50s. So I read 17 true crime books in a row, including new bestsellers. And I learned two things. First, most of them are just horribly written. And the second thing is they're just about awful people doing awful things. And I had a hard time trying to figure out how I could do a true crime book with something of positive value at it. I tracked down a couple stories. I got close on a couple and I decided they didn't work. And just thinking about what was the crime of the century in the United States? And I thought, what was the crime of the 19th century in the United States? And of course, the murder of Abraham Lincoln, no question. Then I dug into that a little bit more and I realized that the last, truly best-selling account of Lincoln's murder was a book called The Day That Lincoln Died by Jim Bishop that came out in 1960 or 1961. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's a long time. We've learned a lot. And I started digging into that story and ended up digging into the last year of the war. And two things became clear. Number one is that we came much closer in the United States to losing our country, so to speak, than we really give credit to. Oftentimes people think, well, after Gettysburg, it was a mopping up, operation after that. The Confederacy was never going to, the stars and bars weren't going to fly from Boston Common or, Chicago or anything like that. The question was the Confederacy going to survive as an independent nation, or was slavery going to survive? And it became clear that that possibility was much closer than I'd ever realized. But the second thing is I dug into the Lincoln assassination. I realized soon that we had John Wilkes Booth all wrong. And it took about a year and a half plus to kind of figure out what the arc of the story was, what stories I was going to tell, which ones I weren't. And once we got that together, my agent was on board, my editor and publisher liked it, and then we were off to the races.
That's an interesting point you make about who you're going to include.
Yeah.
Because you include people who are household names, and then you include people who aren't. They're people who are on the street at the time. They're in the crowd. They're doing all kinds of activities. What made you want to choose certain people for this book because of who they are, or what they were doing?
Well, and there's even sort of a preface to that, in the sense that, well, first of all, the Civil War was not only the bloodiest war in the United States, it remains the single most important event in our history, but it's also the first total war, first modern war, entire societies are mobilized. But if you look at the historiography of the Civil War, 90% or so of the books are military history. They're all about generals and battles and regiments. And that's good. And there's a wonderful literature of it. And maybe not 90%, 80%, whatever. Then there's a chunk of books on Lincoln and politics and some Reconstruction figures. Then a much narrower little column of books about African Americans during the Civil War, or espionage during the Civil War, or women during the Civil War. And what I wanted to do, they never overlap. And what I wanted to do is to have these things overlap in a book, because they all play off each other. And, it's, you can't tell the story of the Civil War by simply telling the story of battles. So it was doing that. And then I was really lucky, John, in that from my office window here in Ann Arbor, with a baseball, I could hit the second largest university library in the United States. And they have everything, or they'll get it for you. So while writing the book, I would easily have 100 books out at any time. And all these regimental histories that were buried in storage, all these accounts by, Union nurses, spies, soldiers and stuff like that. So, I'm digging into this. What I wanted to do is to write a book that would appeal. I've never written for scholars, so I've always written for a broad audience. I wanted to write a book that would appeal to a broad audience, and would appeal to people that also don't read a lot of history necessarily, and don't know that much about the Civil War. And the way you do that is to tell compelling stories and to write about people that they can identify with. So, as I'm writing a chapter about, the siege of Petersburg, or the Battle of Spotsylvania, or African American migration to Washington, D.C., I'm going through lots of things, trying to find those little bits that will stick out, that'll touch the reader, interest the reader, and let them know that while this history took place, 100 whatever years ago, that, it's something they can understand and they can relate to.
Would you say that, although we talk a lot, or we're going to talk a lot this evening about 1865 and what happens in 1865, do you think 1864 is a very pivotal year for the war effort and for the political effort that's going on in the United States?
Oh, absolutely, no question about it. It's really from the spring of 1864 to the spring of 1865. The future of the nation, of the United States, lies in the balance. None of this, it's easy when you know this, John, but looking back in history, it's easy to say, well, of course, the Russian Revolution was going to happen. The conditions were there. This is going to happen, all this, but the reality is that the outcome was never preordained. It wasn't preordained in 1861 or 1862, 1863. And it certainly wasn't in 1864. By the end of the summer of 1864, Lincoln is finished politically. He knows that. He knows he's not going to get reelected. A peace movement is growing in the North that says we've had too much killing. There's no end in sight in this bloody, awful war. Let's just let the South go. So, really deep into 1864, nobody knows what's going to happen. And what I want to do, what I've tried to do in the book, is to let the reader experience that in real time. You can read, we can watch the Titanic, read a book about the Titanic. We know what is going to happen, but in the hands of a skilled writer, you can forget that and just try to grasp on the story. So that's what I'm trying to do. I've tried to do.
For a short time, I lived in Frederick, Maryland, and that pops up in the book as well because of Monocacy. What were your thoughts talking about this military threat on Washington, D.C., something that is too often overlooked by the public, in my opinion?
And part of the way it's overlooked was a couple things. First of all, a lot of memoirs by Confederate officers are often providing rationale for things. Jubal Early, who was the Confederate general who led this incredible march down the Shenandoah Valley, crosses the Potomac and Shepherdstown, and invades the District of Columbia, and was within hours of capturing the White House, the Capitol, burning them, and all of that. And for reasons we don't entirely understand, he blinks and waits, a precious 12 hours too late, whereas his subordinate commanders were all ready to go. He said, "This is all ours." But afterwards, he said, "Well, we weren't really going to do that anyway," as a way to defend it. What also happened is that citizens there was plenty of panic in Washington, D.C., but later on, kind of out of stubborn morale, the local populace said, "Well, we weren't really scared. This wasn't really going to happen." But, Washington, a different commander, an extra few hours, the Capitol and the White House could have been burned again. I mean, there's just no question about it. And the hope with that was possibly to be able to capture Lincoln, members of the Supreme Court, members of Congress, and use them hostages as a way to barter and end of the war.
Was that a very surprising thing for you to consider as well? Did you think about that when you initially went into this project, or was that something that came up later? Wow, we're so close.
It just dug up. It just popped up on the way. Part of what goes on, and this happens to me. So my dad was a Virginian. My mom was actually born in Canada, daughter of Norwegian immigrants, grew up in Minnesota. I was raised very much in the tradition of the lost cause interpretation of the Civil War, which, as your listeners will know, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, Southern politicians with Northern allies decide we're going to rewrite the history of the war. So in the late 19th century, everybody in the North thought that Lee and Davis were all traitors. They should have been hung, all this stuff. Now they're going to get rehabilitated. And now no longer are they traitors, they are great American heroes. Jefferson Davis's statue goes inside the Capitol. There's stamps with Lee on them. The United States Mint puts out a commemorative coin showing Lee and Stonewall Jackson in front of, Stone Mountain and all of this stuff. So this is, and that the war itself had nothing to do with slavery, which is not true. And that it was really an unfortunate squabble between white men. Black people play no role in the war, women play no role in the war, and all that. So this is the version that I'm taught, incidentally, at Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I was a part of that. And then sort of in college and graduate school, I started to realize some of this isn't quite true, but digging into the actual history again with fresh eyes and not having this lost cause version rattling around subconsciously in my mind, I started to see stuff that we had sort of missed along the way. Somebody else could have done it. It just happened to be me. I'm not touting my own horn at all, but that was a great value. The other thing, John, is that the Civil War has never been the sole property of academic historians. Okay. There have been lots and lots and lots, thank God to this day, of amateurs out there. I'll give you an example. There was a gentleman by the name of Arthur F. Lew who spent his career working for, I believe, the Mutual Life Insurance Company out of Pennsylvania. And that was his entire career, raised a family and all that. But on the evenings and weekends for decades, he decided to put together the story of John Wilkes Booth's life in a book called John Wilkes Booth Day by Day. And in the pre-ancestry.com, newspapers.com era, I mean, he must have spent weeks at the Library of Congress going through all of these newspapers. Oh, Booth played Hamlet on this night in St. Louis. The next day, he got on a train to go to St. Charles. He played blah, 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 all that stuff. And as I read that book, I realized Booth wasn't this pathetic second rate actor living in the shadow of his far more famous acting father and brother. He was this great superstar. And so it was sort of looking at evidence that people hadn't looked at or hadn't looked at in a long, long time, sometimes 100 years, and then realizing there's some grit here and things worth looking into.
Well, as I'm sitting in Canada, there's the huge Canadian connection
God,
with that
yes,
story as well. I've been to Montreal and been past some places that Booth and others with the Confederate Secret Service were probably involved with.
absolutely. No question about it. And of course, that was smart. I mean, that the Canadian presence happens, as you know, John, when it became clear in by early 18th, after the battles of Spotsylvania and the Wilderness, and with the siege of Petersburg beginning, the Jefferson Davis and the Confederate High Command now knew without a doubt we can't win a war of attrition. If we just keep battering against the Union, they may lose more people, but we're going to lose people too, and they can replace their soldiers. We can't ours. And so the will to win their independence was still very strong, and they realized they had to try something different. And that thing different was to unleash this terror war against the civilian population of the North to try to nudge them towards making a peace deal, letting the South go, and letting the Confederacy survive.
I really enjoyed the portion of the book. I enjoyed the whole book, but I enjoyed
Oh,
the
good.
portion very much about basically the terror attack on New York City.
Yeah.
Something else that is often overlooked. There have been some others who have discussed it in small amounts, but you went into great detail with it. Talk about that portion of that movement and why that was done and how you researched that.
Well, it again, so the Confederacy now, beginning the late summer and fall of 1864, they're going to try all these other things. And, necessity is the mother of invention. There's a Confederate doctor who travels to Bermuda and buys the clothing of people who have died of smallpox. And his plan is to take it to public markets in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, and to sell it with the hope of creating a smallpox epidemic, whether that could have happened or not. There are plans to blow up the White House. The Confederates are way ahead in inventing landmines, which were known as torpedoes. There's a Confederate chemist who had been a professor of chemistry at Columbia and Princeton who's inventing poison gas at the end of the war. So they're trying all this stuff, but their big plan was to incinerate Manhattan. And so you had 8 Confederate Secret Service agents who were based in Montreal, who under aliases cross the border, ride trains into New York City, and they check into different hotels under aliases. And then one of them goes to a townhouse that's just a block to the east of Washington Square, right in Manhattan, to a chemist's office. And he picks up this large valise that's got all of these bottles of something known as Greek fire. And this was a very old pyrotechnic accelerant. Basically, it's sodium that's dissolved in something. I can't remember what it is. But when it's exposed to air, it bursts into flames. So their plan is to set 19 hotels in Manhattan, between Madison Park and the Battery on fire, and that it's going to overwhelm the fire department. And it should have worked. Unfortunately, they they piled the furniture in the room and the bedding, and they put other things on it and soaked it in turpentine. Pops opens the Greek fire, everything burst into flame. They dashed out the room, but they didn't realize they needed to open the windows to have enough oxygen come in. And had they not done that, I mean, who's to say? I mean, that would have, if you have fires in 19 hotels, that's going to overwhelm the New York City Police Department at that time. So there were things that they came close with, but just couldn't quite pull off. The cool thing about that, John, was that there was a memoir by one of the Secret Service agents, a guy by the name of John Headley. Wrote a book called Confederate Operations in Canada and the United States, and they just talks very openly about his role in that. And and he was, you could tell he stretches some stuff here and there, but he was a great observer of things. So I was able to follow his movements, had a sense of what he's looking at and things like that. And the story just came alive.
You introduced me to a character I'd never heard of before, and that was Lois Adams.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of Lois Adams before, and I've been studying the Civil War for decades, and I'm like, who's Lois Adams? And I was really enthralled with this person. Can you let my audience know who Lois Adams is?
She is astonishing. She's one of the lost riders of the Civil War. So Lois Adams was a single mom in Michigan, sort of hanging, trying to keep the family farm going, but she obviously was literate. She wrote beautifully, and she became the correspondent for some daily newspapers in Detroit, in Washington, D.C. And she is an incredible observer of human life and what's going on, but she also just writes magnificently, and she just sees through things. There's a key moment in 1865 when an abolitionist preacher, African-American abolitionist preacher named Henry Highland Garnett, who, was formerly enslaved and all that, he becomes the first African-American to speak, in the hall of the House of Representatives in the Capitol. And, she's there for it. Other people there, they're writing about it in the choir and what a great orator it was. But, she writes that this is much bigger than people think. I mean, this is an inflection point, a turning point. And she just had the way of seeing through things and just writing in just gorgeous ways. So I used as much of her as I could. I just thought she was fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. She had, it was so interesting to see her perspective of what was
Absolutely.
going on, especially as someone who's never seen her writing before. It was a fresh set of eyes.
And it was discovered by a librarian and again, this is where the non-professional historians, a librarian at the University of Central Michigan, who discovered her stuff, figured out who she was. She, collated all of this and put it into a book, and the book whose name escapes me right at the moment, but it's just fantastic stuff. She's a wonderful writer.
Yeah, that's tremendous. There's a lot in there that I was like really enthralled with, because again, it's like finding that new person after decades and decades of reading a lot of other people, and now here's a new, fresh perspective. That makes everything so much more interesting to me.
Oh, good, great.
When you can read that. I wanted to ask this just for a little side note. You've written previously about the Tulsa race massacre and that pivotal moment in American history. How do you think this book fits into that broader mission of yours to tell stories like that?
Well, that's a really great question. I have certainly I for your audience, I was born and raised in Tulsa, and Tulsa was the site of the single worst incident of racial violence in all of American history. Over the course of 12 hours, more than 1,000 homes and businesses belonging to African Americans were looted and burned to the ground. 10,000 people were made homeless. We don't know how many people died to this day. Reasonable estimates go from maybe 75 to as high as 300. No white person ever went to jail for any of this. And it was all swept under the rug very, very efficiently. And my personal family history in Tulsa only happened in 1921. My personal family history in Tulsa just goes back to the 1930s. So I didn't have like a grandparent to ask about it. But even as a kid, as a 10-year-old, I would hear whites, maybe adults, maybe neighbors, talking about this race riot. And then when a kid would come into the room, they'd shut up and change the subject. And that piqued my interest. And then, I started researching it, writing about it in college, and wrote my first book, Death in a Promised Land. It came out in 1982. And I've been involved with that story ever since then. And my previous book to this one, The Groundbreaking, really tells how the massacre was covered up for 50 years and how it took us 50 years to get the story out. So I'm a little used to digging into subjects that involve race and things like that, and trying to researching them using traditional research skills, but also trying to use more of a novelistic approach. I mean, everything, I'm not making up anything, but
Mm.
to use the techniques of novelists to bring them together. And, I'd written about race, I'd written about the United States, I'd written about the South, I had lived in the East, and just with a long connection to the Civil War, I thought that maybe I'd earned my right to go ahead and write about it. Um, Academic historians normally have a specialty. This is what they do. This is what they do. Even though I teach at a university, again, I really write for mass audiences. Somebody once said, a writer, I cannot think of her name, a novelist who's still alive, who said that the advice that you should writers should only write about what they know. She said that's the worst advice ever, because if that's what you do, you can write maybe one book and 8 poems. So if it's just natural. You have to write about other things as well. And I thought this was not too grand of a leap, but it was one that I was comfortable doing.
That's fantastic. I really want to follow up on that with a question here. I do want to give a shout out to Pitt History Guy. Welcome in. Thank you
Let's
for
go
being
Pitt.
here.
I hope.
Yes, he's a big Pittsburgh guy. So there you go. Welcome in, my friend. I really want to touch on this aspect of academic versus basically popular history in a way. I don't want to, I guess
Sure.
we can use that term for tonight. As someone who is now in the academic realm, trying to earn their PhD, but who came from the blue collar background and such,
Right.
I often go back to how would I tell this history to someone who I grew up around,
Me too.
who's not involved in academics. Do you think for someone like us, we have this kind of a thing where it's not a reckoning with where we grew up or how we grew up, but it's kind of like a mission to just be like, we need to get the people who aren't coming into our classrooms, who aren't seeing us at a roundtable event. They're at different places.
No, absolutely. No question about it. I've often kept in the back. My mom grew up in a working class family in Minneapolis, and her younger sister, Aunt Connie, I've always kept her in the back of my mind. I mean, she barely got out of high school, but, was bright, could tell a good story, and I was raised by the World War II generation. My dad fought, all my uncles fought. My mom worked for the Army during the war. One of my aunts was a wave during the war. So I had stories of the Great Depression and World War II growing up, and that was very much a part of it. So I'd always wanted to do that. But there was also so I got my PhD in 1982. So it's in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm in graduate school at Duke. And that's also time when university-based historians started to go away from writing narrative history and instead are writing about theory and agency and whatever in the heck it is. And what happened is that the best historians of writing narrative history, they were almost all journalists. Taylor Branch, David McCullough, Ambrose, all of these people. And there was a tradition of that with Bruce Canton and others. But those are the people, Robert Caro, people like that I had admired. Those guys and me, for that matter. I mean, we work our tail off in research. I mean, this is not history light by any means. And my books are long end notes describing how conclusions were reached. But again, it's packaging it in a form that the public could do. And I was lucky in that, John, in that I worked for 10 years at the Smithsonian. And the big lesson there was that the American public is actually deeply interested in our history. It's just they have no interest at all in the way that scholars talk about it. And they want stories. They want stories that will resonate with them.
Do you think that's too often dismissed by people? They're especially in the academic world, because I've heard that from some of my academic colleagues where they're like, "Oh, no one wants to listen to this anymore," and all I thought was, "Well, it's about storytelling." I thought it's not about
No,
the $10 word of a theory issue that we keep bringing up.
right. I think there's a lot of tensions with that. I mean, things have changed. So I'm a lecturer to begin with,
Mhm.
and in my department, which is not very big, is an undergraduate department. So we don't have graduate students, stuff like that. But the University of Michigan History Department is a storied department, well known. But I mean, things have changed. I learned, when I first came, whatever, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that they no longer taught a course on the British Empire. And I just thought that's the most amazing thing in the world. And I took modern European history, things like we took social history and intellectual history, but also there were stories that you told and the arc of it. And that's what always interested me as a kid, much more so than theory,
Mhm.
and wanting to be able to share that with others.
Mhm. Yeah, that I feel that I feel that as well, and
I'll
I
tell you a
see.
quick story.
Yeah,
So,
please.
like my books are not generally reviewed in scholarly journals, but Taylor Branch, an American historian who wrote, the 3-volume story about, America during the Martin Luther King years,
Mhm.
parting the waters, Pulitzer Prize, and all that. Um, I knew him a little bit. A journalist, grew up in Atlanta. He felt that the books on the movement and King were missing a lot of the emotion of the movement, and other things. So he writes this brilliant series of books. When I first came to Michigan, he came and spoke at my department, and a historian at the university said, "Well, the Journal of American History just did an entire volume dedicated to analyzing your work on King and all of that. And what did you think about it?" And Brant said, "I have no idea. I've never read it." And it was, "Don't you want to read it?" Not particularly, and it's just, a lot of those people have a different audience. They're trying to reach readers, they're trying to win prizes, certainly, and have good sales, but they're not thinking about how things are going to get dissected.
How did you want to use that kind of a model to talk about the Lincoln assassination in the book? How did you want to make it more accessible for people or make them think differently about it?
Well, there are a couple of different ways. I mean, first, because I cover a lot, there's a lot that happens between the spring of 1864 and the spring of
Yeah.
1865. And my book is the less than 300 pages of narrative. I can't remember what it is, 250 or something like that. So there's a lot of stuff I was going to leave out. I mean, I don't talk about Reconstruction policy. Lots of stuff goes out the door. Once I've connected Booth on several occasions to the Confederate Secret Service, I'm not super interested in rehashing a lot about some of the other conspirators, what happens afterwards with all that.
Mm.
One thing I wanted to do with Lincoln was we all have our version of Lincoln, and he's normally, to borrow a term applied to Robert E. Lee, he's kind of the marble man. I mean, Lincoln is our greatest president. There's no question about it. No one comes close. I don't know if we ever deserve such an incredible man, but I wanted to turn him into a human being. So while we do hear the second inaugural, we hear all of that, the book opens with his relationship with his youngest son, Tad, who is this much different person than we've been told. And about his special relation with that, I talk about Lincoln's physical ailments. We're not just losing a president, a family's losing a husband and a father. So I wanted to bring him down to earth. There was a wonderful John Ford, the American film director, considered by many, including me, that he was probably our greatest director ever. Did Stagecoach and
Mhm.
the Searchers and all sorts of stuff. In 1930, in the late 1930s, he made a movie about Lincoln called Young Mr. Lincoln, and he approaches this young up and coming starred Henry Fonda and asked him if he'll do it. And Fonda was like, "Oh no, I could never play him, the great man." And Ford was like, "Oh no, 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 you idiot! Not that Lincoln, but the dumb lawyer in Illinois." And Fonda said, "Well, I can do that." So I try to give a different version of him and just not regurgitate the same material and get a sense of it and have, we all know what happens in Ford's theater. And I wanted to build it up to when it happens and then move on from it and move on to its impact.
Do you think it's important for us, especially now, to showcase these quote great men of history as flawed figures?
Was sure. But I think that's gone on for a long time. In a way, what I'm trying to do, kind of, John, is a little bit the opposite.
Hmm.
We live in a largely cynical era. We live where a lot of people don't have a lot of hope for the future of our country. And what I wanted to do is to remind people with these incredible women nurses, these incredible courageous soldiers, Charles Gilbert Gould, who pierces the line at Petersburg by himself at age 19. There are incredible heroic acts and great acts of sacrifice. What I want to do is to remind Americans that we have so much to be proud of our past. And we also have models that endured even more division than we have. And I wanted to celebrate that. I mean, the loyal Americans won the war. You can't underestimate the importance of Lincoln, of Sherman, of Grant, some of these other people, and certainly not of the Union Army, what they were able to do, and certainly not of African Americans, especially African American troops. Lincoln said, without them, we would have lost, or the Confederacy would have survived. But in the end, you have this incredible coalition, unprecedented in our history, of loyal Americans, men and women, black and white, native born and immigrant, free and unfree, who join together. They defeat the Confederacy. They destroy slavery. They preserve the Union, and they give all of America a second chance. Not only do they expand notion of freedoms, 1 out of every 7 Americans goes from being enslaved to being free as a result of the Civil War. But they also, gave us, the country that we all grew up in, or many of us grew up in. And we stand on their shoulders. And I wanted to remind everyone of that and remind everyone of the greatness of the American people. We have heroes, and we need to remind ourselves of them so we don't get lost in these, depressing scenarios that we're trying to cope with.
If you could bring one person from the book in to talk to your students, who would it be?
Well, God, jeepers. Well, I mean, it's hard not to say Lincoln or Booth, but I tell you the figure that really blew me away in many regards, and boy, a lot of those nurses as well too. But Sherman is just a fascinating figure. He was a banker in San Francisco before the war. He was also the commandant of a military school in Louisiana. He was a troubled guy who later admitted that if it hadn't been for his children, he would have committed suicide. But he was the true genius, American genius, out of the Civil War. And Sherman's march was unprecedented, changes military history. But it also became, not because of him, but because of the African Americans, it becomes this march of liberation. And it's just amazing what he saw. I would love to talk to him any day. Absolutely. Who did you like? Who would you want to bring?
Well, because you introduced me to her, I got to talk to Lois.
Well, sure. Heck yeah.
I would love to have dinner with her and just ask a series of questions, because I love meeting new people, even if they're historical. And I think that would be a really interesting conversation. And I think I would learn a lot from her. And
absolutely.
I think that when we talk about women's history, she has to be included in that,
and Civil War history, absolutely.
Yeah, and Civil War history, obviously. Yeah. I mean, that's the person who needs that story to be amplified, 10 times over. And I think I'd want to dine with her and figure out some things about why she why she wrote some things down, and maybe was there something she didn't write down that she wished she would have.
Oh, exactly.
You
I'm
know.
with you. Please add me to the dinner list.
Oh yeah, yeah. We'll do that. We'll go for coffee. Uh, uh, no, I really appreciate, like I said, your thoughts on how we can bring this to the public in new ways, and we can make it accessible. I'm all about accessibility and
Right.
breaking down that barrier. At the same time, you have on the back of the book the some of the praise is coming from academics like McPherson and
Sure.
Gallagher, and I think that's a really interesting perspective, in that they're also seeing a lot of us who are in the academic circles or who have worked with academics for years are seeing the power in or the necessity in creating something like this just to reach the audience in the 21st century. It's almost like we're tired of talking to each other now. Let's get out there and do the hard
Yeah.
work, right? And make this a communal experience.
No, I was incredibly honored and touched to have, James McPherson and Gary Gallagher, write blurbs for the book. And, and certainly McPherson, Battle Cry of Freedom was a bestseller. And Gary Gallagher's books they're accessible as well too. So what's great is, this needs to be a team effort. I mean, obviously we need to have scholars that are drilling down into things, that are explaining things. All of that's extremely important, but and they're going to talk to each other, generally speaking, not entirely.
Mm.
And, the reenactment communities, all of those people doing the work. And again, this sort of legion of amateurs who's doing really great work. But it's really to get the story out there and get it out in different ways to different audiences. And you need different techniques and different languages to do it.
What would your advice be to someone who's just coming up as a historian to do that, to make that a reality?
Well, I would say that it's, I mean, bless their hearts, because having been in a PhD program as well, too, you have 9 million things to read. But um, don't just read the scholars, don't just read the scholarly literature. Read these popular, literary nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, writers, and see how they do it. Just a few weeks ago, I finally got around to reading, even though it's been out for like 40 years, to Edmund Morris's first volume on Teddy Roosevelt, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. And I was just blown away by how good it is. It is, it was, I think it won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a bestseller. And, uh, and it's all extremely well documented, all that. But he has a way of telling a story that once you dive into it, you just don't want to put it down. So I think it's important not to disparage, if you're a graduate student, don't disparage the works of people who have found out ways to write popularly, and instead try to study them and to see if there are any techniques that you can use. And, read. The more you read, I certainly read a lot of fiction, classic novelists. I, love, Dickens and the Brontes and all that stuff. And, you can learn how to tell a story from them as well.
Hmm. I started an exercise routine every day where I read for 30 minutes as soon as I get out of bed.
That's
And
awesome.
while my friends are doing the gym thing, I'm doing that. And I've told students about that. I said, maybe that's a way to exercise your cognitive ability to get ready for the day, but it's always something outside of my field.
So, John, if you don't mind, what are you reading now? Or what have you been reading lately?
I've been reading a lot on. I just finished up another First World War book, actually, because I don't teach it, and so
Right.
it's kind of like my hobby now,
Right.
because I'm studying digital war. So to go back and study the First World Wars, really interesting to me. I have a bunch of books laying around though that I have to review. So
Right.
when I'm not doing that, I just finished a book on Hiroshima,
Right.
and getting ready to read one on Nagasaki from the same author. So they're things that are history, but yet they're not what I'm working on for my day-to-day work. I barely read fiction. It's not something that I usually do. I like to read nonfiction. But with the books that come in from publishers, I find myself going,
Oh, I'm
well,
sure you're deluged with books.
yeah,
I'll tell you, here's a little quip so that came out in an interview I did recently, but they, asked what are you reading lately? I said, well, it's kind of funny. I had just finished reading um uh Robert, is it what's his name? Hold on. Robert K. Massey's 1967 book, Nicholas and Alexandra,
hmm,
about, the Romanovs, the last czars
yeah,
of Russia. And that was a groundbreaking book. I mean, Massey was very smart, tells this great story. I mean, I can't imagine more clueless rulers of any major nation in the history of the world.
yep.
And, but it appealed to women as well, too. I'd read that. And then I'd always wanted to read, and then I have started finally getting around to reading Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns about the
Hmm.
African American Great Migration, another prize winner. But I'd never read and always wanted to read the Da Vinci Code. So I'm reading that as well. And I realized if you sort of took a Venn diagram of those three books and wherever they all intersect in the center is kind of what I'm aiming for. Something that's well researched, but has got a popular reach and has got a story compelling that the readers want to keep turning the page.
Mm. Yeah, that's how I feel about when I read like Margaret Macmillan or someone like that. It's
Right.
it's a page turner. I'm not looking at the end notes or the footnotes. I'm just looking at the overall
Yeah.
picture. And sometimes it's a relaxing read in that way where you're embracing the moment in that and you're not worried about what end note do I need to go look at for this
Right.
little thing, right? We do
Exactly.
that. We do that in our daily life. We don't want to do that first thing in
Exactly.
the morning. Uh, no, that's fantastic. I do want to ask you one more thing about Lincoln in 1865.
Sure.
We wrap up here soon. What are your thoughts when you look at his second inaugural?
Oh, it's it's the greatest speech ever delivered by an American, in my opinion. I
Mm,
mean, it's just absolutely an incredible speech, so short. What he hits upon, the nature of the language, and of course, that chapter, there's so much drama that happens when he delivers it, this deluge of rain beforehand, and it's giant parade, all these people coming. And then as soon as he steps out of the Capitol up to the podium, the sun breaks through and this hush falls upon the crowd. And, for the first time ever, African Americans are there in large numbers at an inaugural address. And then, as we learn later, 20 feet away is John Wilkes Booth, who later says, I, should have shot the son of a bitch then, or whatever he said.
mm.
And no, it's an absolutely magnificent speech, and it is one of the true great, if not the great hallmarks of American oratory, hands down.
I grew up near Gettysburg, only 25 miles away.
What
And
community?
pardon?
What community?
Chambersburg.
Oh yeah, of course.
It was burned in 64 by
Yeah, exactly.
Early's men, which is also bringing things home for me when I read the book. And I purposely started, fights amongst friends in the pubs in Gettysburg saying that the second inaugural was Lincoln's greatest speech because they're going to say Gettysburg Address.
No way.
And then I would just let them pontificate about it and then just leave them there to be mad about it. And, but I always thought that was his greatest speech was the second inaugural.
And then for your listeners, the next time if you don't know about this already, next time you go to the Lincoln Memorial, of course, they have the Gettysburg Address chiseled on the wall on one side. The other side is the second inaugural. So one of the workmen started to turn a F into an E, and you can actually find this almost typo where they kind of filled it in. So next time you're there, see if you can find that.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone in chat's going to agree with me about that one being greater than the Gettysburg Address. I know there's a lot of Gettysburg fans on the page. I'll hear about it in the comments later.
Of course.
No, but for everyone who is tuning into us again, remember the link to the book is pinned at the top of the chat. Please go check this out from Penguin Random House. Greatly appreciate you all being here. Pardon me, Scott. One final question here. What are you working on next?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, and I would love to hear some suggestions. So, for any listeners as well, too. Look, I'm an open guy. You can find me, Scott Ellsworth at the University of Michigan. Email I also finally have a website up, ScottEllsworthAuthor.com. You can connect, connect to me through that. But I don't know. I'm looking for that next subject, and having my wife and I are the sons of twin boys that just twin young men that just graduated from private colleges in California. We've got a lot of tuition to still pay, so I could use some good ideas.
Well, there you go, everybody. If you have an idea for Scott, please pass it on to him.
Yeah, and if you just want to, vent or whatever about the book, just let me know. It's called Midnight at the Potomac. It's gotten some great reviews already, and I've heard a lot of people. But take a look at it. I hope you like it.
Yes, I'm sure a lot of you will. You'll really enjoy it. It was a fast read for me too because it reads very accessibly,
Good,
and it was great. And I loved how you also put it into different acts, like the scene,
good.
like acts of a play. It was
Wow.
great and really readable and really enjoyable. And so is this conversation, Scott. I've really enjoyed having you on tonight. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, John, and I hope that our paths cross again.
I'm sure they will, my friend.
All right, thank you.
Thank you to everyone in the chat this evening. I really appreciate each and every one of you, and I'm sure many of you are going to come in later after we go offline. Please make sure that you check out the book. The link is in the description of this video. Be well, everybody. Take care of yourself, and don't stop reading.